Okay, so as I see our attendance numbers climb up to 100 and hopefully launch well past that, why don't we pick up this conversation formally? It's a pleasure to have all of you here joining what we're calling an educational webinar and panel discussion on the evolution of accelerated access pathways in Canada. I'm joined by an exceptional group of panelists and participants today, not only all of you, but Sabrina Hanna, the Chief Change Officer of the Cancer Collaborative, Peter Dyrda, Director of Pharmaceuticals Review at Canada's Drug Agencies, Allison Wills, a partner at 20 Cents, and John Snowden, the Executive Director of Value, Access and Policy at Amgen Canada. They are all coming together in a very timely and opportune conversation about a subject that is very important and relevant to, I think, all of you and many more. This conversation about accelerated access pathways is a timely and important one for Canada, for the world, and there's been enormous progress, change, and dynamism even over the last 12 months since many of you came together to have another sort of primer on this subject, courtesy of Allison and a broader group in 2024. We thought it was timely and welcoming to bring you all back together, to reflect on what's happened in the last 12 months, to look at some of the successes, to identify the challenges still to come, and to think about how best to tackle them together over the coming months. The group putting this on is the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. For those not familiar with RHC, it is a collaborative of health system partners committed to providing leadership, insights, and solutions required to make Canadian health systems stronger, more resilient, and more able to adapt to change. It really is focused on bringing together three different constituencies, all of whom are responsible for sort of shared problem solving. We need the voices of patient groups and advocacy organizations, the voices of the broader life sciences ecosystem, and the voices of industry. Together, those groups power RHC, and they allow us to focus on two core objectives. The first is to optimize the use of healthcare data to better inform decision-making. And the second is to expand and accelerate access to innovative health technologies, vaccines, diagnostics, therapeutics, and devices. This intersection of better data for better access is central to many of the conversations that we're going to have today and many of the topics we're going to cover. So with that, I will step out of the way and pass the microphone to one of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition's two fantastic co-chairs, Eva Villalba, Executive Director of the Quebec Cancer Patient Coalition. So Eva, to you, thanks for joining us and thanks for your remarks.
Thanks, Ross. So I'll keep it short. I'm very excited for today's webinar and discussion. As you mentioned, accelerated access to innovations is really a key pillar of the work that we've been doing at the RHC since the pandemic started and we got this group of motivated change makers together. So I think today's conversation is going to be really important and exciting, and we're happy that there's actually an evolution in access pathways. So that's what we're excited to hear from our panelists today. And I just want to invite everyone to think about the RHC not just as the host of today's webinar, but as really the convener of all these different stakeholders that can actually have an honest conversation about what's happening, but also come up with, shared solutions that we can all participate in and find shared objectives that are important to all of us. So with that, I will pass it on to our first panelist. Thank you so much.
And Eva, just before I pass to Allison, I will just mention to folks, just as the run of show, we're going to take about a half an hour or so for Allison to give us a level set, an update to inspire us on what's happened and what's still to come. Then Peter Dyrda from CDA is going to jump in and do a little bit of a deeper dive into the key role that CDA itself has played in these conversations and the importance that this topic holds to the organization through its new strategic plan and many of its efforts and initiatives. Then we're going to open it up to a broader conversation with the panelists, John and Sabrina jumping in. And that'll take us to about 1 o'clock, and I'll moderate that conversation. Then we have all of you, we hope, throwing your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. So you will see a little Q&A icon with a question mark on it. Please feel free as soon as you want, as many as you want, as many times as you want, throw your questions in. We'll be monitoring those questions. We'll be trying to get to as many of them as we can. We'll fuse them together and synergize them and integrate them, feed them back to this group, and hopefully we'll push the conversation forward that way. And then just before 1:30, we will free you to the rest of your days. So thank you again. Allison, thanks for letting me jump back in, and I now cede the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Eva, and welcome everybody who are on the line, I hope from across Canada. I see there's over 150 of you on here. So in the next half hour, what I'm going to do is take you through the evolution of accelerated access pathways in Canada. This is a follow-on to a webinar we did about a year ago where we talked about some of these concepts. And as Eva mentioned, it's fantastic. There has been an evolution. There's quite a few details in here, so I'm hoping you guys are up for quite a bit of information that's going to get us to a lively discussion in the second part of this session. I just want to say a couple of disclosures for myself that I'm an owner and employee of 20 Cents, and our clients are both from the public and private sectors. And important is that I am the co-chair of the Real World Evidence and Outcomes-Based Agreements Working Group, and we receive research funding from some industry members that are listed below. Okay, so let's get into it. Today's agenda, I'm going to take you briefly through a refresher on where Canada was a year ago and just make sure that we're all sort of level set on some of the terms because I know there's a lot of acronyms in this space, so sometimes a bit hard to follow. Then the bulk of this presentation is the evolution of accelerated access pathways in Canada and their impact on patient. And I just want to use that word impact. It's really important to keep that in mind as we go through all this information. What is the impact of these different pieces that have been coming together in our country? I'm going to be talking about two initiatives in particular. The CDA's, Canada Drugs Agency's TLR, Time Limited Recommendation Category, and the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance's PTAP pathway, Temporary Access Process Pathway. We have some examples now in Canada. And then also there's a new pilot project from the Ontario government that has been announced to fast track some cancer drugs. So we'll look at those, see what the impact has been so far, and see what the opportunities are for the future. And I'll finish off with a few concluding thoughts around where Canada is at. Can we catch up to what's going on internationally? And what does this look like? What's next for us for timely access for patients to novel therapies? Okay, so let's get right into it. Where were we a year ago? And if you really want to, you can go watch that webinar from last year and the slides, everything's available online thanks to the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. I'm sure Ross and the team, you guys can link those if you'd like. So very quickly, this is the 1 hour presentation and the half an hour presentation just in one slide. So what we learned last year is that healthcare decision-making has become increasingly challenging due to high uncertainties as many novel therapies with a high unmet patient need are coming to market with limited or immature but promising evidence. So we have evidence gaps, but these really amazing, promising new therapies that are coming to market. Timely access to novel therapies has become increasingly challenging for Canadian patients. This is not new news. We've talked about it a lot, but some dates around this from NOC, so Notice of Compliance, it's the regulatory approval, to the first public listing, access in Canada in the public system takes around 630 days. We know, number 3, that other countries have implemented formalized pathways and frameworks that are helping enable timely access to these drugs. When there's high uncertainties, they have some sort of framework or systems in place to be able to make sure that the drugs can still be paid for by the public plans, but that there's value for payers and value and timely access for patients. So this has sometimes enabled patient access as early as the same day as regulatory approval. So when I look at that, the bar is set very high. Some countries have figured out on the day that regulatory approval happens, the payer is providing listing and access for patients. That's kind of called day 0 access. Here in Canada, we don't have a formalized early access pathway or managed access framework. And when I say formalized, I mean a pathway that gets us all the way from NOCC to a payer paying for that drug. But we do have processes and activities and pieces, we're going to talk more about them today, that resemble a lot of those approaches that we've seen work internationally. We have INES's Promise of Therapeutic Value recommendation category. That's been in place since 2018. I'm not going to talk about that today. It could be a different webinar, but let me know if you want more information on that. We have CDA, AMC's time limited recommendation category and the PCP temporary access process. That was all coming to light about a year ago. And then finally from that webinar, we thought, what's needed next? And really what we talked about was that we need to further define roles and responsibilities of everyone in the ecosystem to figure out how to make a pathway like this work and make sure that it works for everyone, including patients, data holders, industry, all the different players need to be aligned. So I took a look at this and I want to note one thing. All of these things still remain true for today. I would just say that here I want to make note that we have some new data from IQVIA Canada. Thanks to them for that. That actually in 2024 they looked at from NOC to first public listing. The average time was 598 days. So that 630 is about a bit outdated, but we're still in the 600-day time range for patients to get access to a drug that receives approval in Canada. A little bit of definition so I don't lose you along the way. We talk about these frameworks and pathways, agreements and processes. I'm just going to put them in three buckets for you. On the left, we have frameworks and pathways that we see globally being implemented. These are types of formal managed access frameworks and pathways used internationally. So you'll hear all of these acronyms, but I'm going to talk a little bit about managed access agreements today. So managed access, that's the overarching sort of everything, all the way from regulatory down to who's paying for the drug when there's high evidence uncertainties. These frameworks and pathways always have elements of a financial agreement for the drug. So how much is being paid for the drug between the manufacturer and the payer. And then they have data collection to support new evidence generation. As I said, there's evidentiary gaps. So what we're doing here in these pathways is generating additional evidence to help the healthcare decision makers make that final decision in the future around how are they going to continue to fund the drug, what's the best way for value and access that supports the payer initiative or payer goals, as well as the patient access and the best health outcomes for patients. Moving on to agreements. So we have these in Canada as well, global Canada and Quebec. The types of market access agreements that we mostly see in Canada, you're probably familiar with, are product listing agreements. Often in Canada, this is a rebate type agreement. So that's the standard agreements that we have. This is between a payer and a manufacturer, and these are negotiated in Canada by the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. But we have also seen in some cases where there's therapies that come with these evidence uncertainties, other innovative agreements being put in place. Maybe that's an outcomes-based agreement where we're looking at how the drug performs in the real world. And so for all of these outcomes or innovative-based agreements or value-based agreements, there would also be, of course, this financial agreement, but data collection to support new evidence generation. So what's used in those frameworks and pathways can also be used in these individual agreements, and you don't always need a pathway for an agreement to be put in place. So that's what we've seen in Canada. And then on to the processes that resemble these frameworks and pathways and manage access-like approaches. I'm going to talk about the bottom two. So TLR, the CDA's time limited recommendation category, and PTAP. And then this year we're going to add on this Ontario program that's just been launched. So I hope that I've kept you guys, that we're all on the same page. I know that's a lot. Let's keep going. One more thing from last year. So there's two Canadian processes when they were announced in the fall of 2023. The CDA's reimbursement, TLR, and PCP's PTAP. So I'm going to refer to them as TLR and PTAP going forward. It was really a question that I had was like, wow, is this our path to our first accelerated access pathway? Again, we're missing that, the automatic link to the payer jurisdiction paying, but this is really quite interesting and good. And we're going to see some examples now. So how this works is that at the CDA level, HTA recommendations are time limited and contingent on evidence generation and formal reassessment. It's intended for drugs that receive an NOCC with Health Canada. That means that additional evidence is going to be generated already for Health Canada and their approval. Confirmatory trial data that is associated with the uncertainty outlined in the NOCC must be provided within 3 years. The reassessment will be within 180 days. RWE is not really being considered right now, maybe, and it doesn't link to that payer process, right? I mentioned. The PCPA, they themselves developed this set of principles called PTAP that actually will inform negotiations of TLR drugs, and then these are paired together. So a TLR drug comes through and it has NOCC, is eligible for TLR, the manufacturer submits it as such, it's picked up as that file, and then once it goes through, if it gets a positive recommendation through TLR, it would go through the PTAP process at the PCPA. So there's a whole bunch of principles that exist for that as well, but I don't think we'll get into that today. So that's everything you need to know about where we were last year. There's of course a gazillion details, but I really want to get to the evolution of these accelerated access pathways in Canada and their impact for patients. So what have we seen in the last year? I think it's been a really busy year for everyone. And we're going to look at these two pieces: update on the TLR and the PCP and PTAP processes, and then the Ontario government new pathway, the new pilot project to fast track access to some cancer drugs. Here we go. Let's get into the details. So for TLR and PTAP, 2 drugs have now entered that TLR and PTAP pathway, and we've seen some results available now with the initial phase of the process. So I'm going to take you through that. There have been 2 studies analyzing those early results and experience published in peer-reviewed journals. So a lot of information that I'm going to share with you come from those. And also we saw that CDAMC held a public consultation early 2025, which also included looking at the TLR pathway and what they can be doing to improve on that. So as we talked about earlier, the time from NOC to first public listing on average in 2024 for all drugs was 598 days. And in the almost 2 years since the launch of TLR and PTAP, 2 drugs have entered the pathway, and the results for this initial phase of the processes are quite promising. So the first drug is called Epkinly, epcoritamab, and it received time from NOC to first public listing that happened in 306 days. It's quite a significant decrease. And then recently we saw another drug in HER2 in gastric cancer that actually got first listing in 117 days. So from a very high level view, it is undisputable that this TLR and PTAP process, that they are speeding up time to access. Okay, so fantastic, right? The numbers don't lie. Oh, so that numbers don't lie. But what I want to do is really get into the details of this so we can have a discussion around these processes and their impact, the impact that I mentioned at the beginning. So more details coming. I've just put here for you, you'll have access to the slides later, the 2 studies that have come out that have analyzed these experiences. So I'll just mention that the one on the left is myself, Arif Mitha from 20 Cents, and Dr. Catherine Lau that worked on this. And then the publication on the right is from the team at AbbVie. So they had the first drug that went through, the epcoritamab, Epkinly, and also 360 Public Affairs and the Pharmaceutical group. So these 2 are quite interesting reads if you'd like to go in and take a look at some of the early insights from these pathways in an academic perspective. Okay, so now here's all the details, and I'm going to take you through this. Hold on, stay with me. So this line down the middle where we have the stars, that is NOCC on this timeline, and what we're looking at is an aligned view of the time from NOCC to first provincial listing in calendar days for some recent NOCC drugs in oncology that have received first public listing. So this is from the publication that I worked on. Here we're showing you 2 drugs and the 2 on the top went through the regular pathway, and the 2 on the bottom are now through the TLR and PTAP processes. So I'm just going to show you high level first. So first we see for the regular drugs, they went through 509 and 549 days. This is really close to that 600-day average that we saw earlier. And I want to note here, all of the different processes and agencies are on the left. So we have the time from the regulatory approval, the NOCC, to the sponsor HTA submission, CDA AMC's appraisal timeline, their draft to final recommendation timeline, the PCP initiation and consideration, the time that it took for the PCP negotiation, and then the first provincial listing. That's everything that's showing here on this timeline. So really from NOCC to that first listing patient possibility of having access. So I'll get you to note that for the top 2, we see that these are sequential. All these processes happen one after another, and we're getting to these 500 plus days. But for Epkinly and for HER2 in gastric cancers, we're seeing that it's quite shorter. Those 306 and 117 days appear here. And we're seeing here there's some overlap in some of these processes. Now, there's some things that are happening in parallel, whereas we haven't seen that traditionally in other files. So let's zoom in on these 2 drugs, and I'm going to provide you some even more details for that. So this is the same view of just the 2 TLR drugs, TLR PTAP drugs. So for Epkinly, it's on the top. This was a new drug submission. And here we see the manufacturer, they did not leverage the pre-NOC parallel HTA submission process, which is also called Target Zero. So you see that there, it took them 46 days after NOCC to submit the file to CDA. What's really interesting here is that the PCPA's processes, these two bars of 49 and 98, they were able to start initiation phase at the draft review report issuance from CDA AMC. Now, for those of you who know, usually the PCPA needs to wait until the final recommendation comes out from the PCPA. And here we see the file getting picked up much earlier during the CDA AMC process. So that's the key takeaway from EPKINLY is that we saw that file being picked up much earlier. Some key dates of interest, that PCP engagement letter was issued prior to the final recommendation coming out from HTA, from CDA. And also we see here the number 26, Ontario and Quebec listed this drug 26 days after the PCPA LOI. So that's also quite fast. So we're getting down to that 306 days. For Enhertu, now in gastric cancers, this, maybe the context is a bit different because this is a supplemental new drug submission, which means that this drug already exists on the market for other indications. Here, the manufacturer did leverage the pre-NOC parallel HD submission process. So Target Zero, a fantastic example. They actually submitted this as a negative 108 days before their NOCC was granted. We see then that the HTA appraisal could go, it started earlier as well during the NOCC. So this is exactly what that parallel review process is supposed to do, enable the files to be treated earlier. And then the PCPA, again, was able to start their initiation phase at draft review report issuance from the HTA body. All this is happening prior to NOC, so pretty amazing. Some dates of interest, I don't know if this is just happenstance, but the NOCC date and the PCPA engagement letter issue date, they're the same. So that came out both on January 17, 2025. The CDA's final recommendation and the PCPA negotiation process concluded date, they're just one day apart. So it gets that final recommendation on April 23rd from HTA. It's a positive TLR. And then the next day, we have the conclusion of the negotiation process of the PCPA. And then we saw that 20 days after that, Ontario achieved listing. So got listing in those first days, in 20 days. Here, what's really important, we're seeing this overlap and prioritization. Let's take a look at sort of the key points that we want to take away from this. And I hope everybody's still with me on this one. So a couple of things. What are our preliminary observation results from these first two files? So compared to the conventional reimbursement pathway, this TLR and PTAP processes together, they significantly reduce the time to first provincial listing. So we saw those days as compared to the average. It's really fantastic. What I'll have you note is that there was no acceleration in each agency's review time observed. I'm going to go back to the other slide. So all of these individual processes were still done in the same amount of time, basically. None of the agencies are speeding up what they're doing. They're just doing it at different times versus when they're usually able to. The most significant accelerator within the TLR and PTAP pathway is the PCPA's prioritization and processing of the file in parallel to the CDAMC's health technology assessment review process rather than subsequently. So we saw moving the PCPA being enabled to pick up that file earlier is really making a huge impact on that whole overall timeline. I would also say, I didn't write it here, it depends as well if the manufacturer is able to submit earlier to the HT body, to CDA, then that Target Zero piece would also make a big impact. But so far, really the key part is prioritization at the PCPA of these files and the ability to pick up the file earlier. We saw that listing decisions were taking much faster than for drugs that go through the standard process, and really that an accelerated access pathway in Canada can indeed expedite patient access when all parties agree to work together. Now, I always like to look at the flip side of things as well. So what are the opportunities and remaining questions that we have about the impact and the potential for TLR and PTAP? So I have some questions. I hope maybe you guys have these too, and we'll hear a little bit from the discussion as well after. So prioritization is the key thing here. Will the PCPA continue to prioritize TLR and PTAP files ahead of other files in the queue, as it appeared to be the case with EPKINLY and Enhertu? If so, will a more explicit prioritization policy be added to the PTAP principles? For me, this wasn't very clear when I read the PTAP principles that that was going to happen, that the file was going to be picked up earlier. It would perhaps be helpful if this is something that will keep happening, if that was sort of spelled out more clearly in the processes. The number two piece is eligibility. In the publication that came out from the AbbVie team, they did an analysis of drugs that received NOC/C status from Health Canada between 2020 and 2024, and they found that very few drugs, only 4 of the 30 drugs that got NOC/C in that time frame, would have met the current strict eligibility criteria required to benefit from TLR, and it really limits the potential benefits of these programs. So yeah, there's a potential to broaden the scope to more drugs. And I'm going to show you a little chart in just a second with how many NOCCs we've had by year. 3, further evaluation. So we've had 2 drugs go through the first part of these access steps of this pathway. But of course, there's that confirmatory data that needs to come back for follow-up and another HTA review. We really can't judge the success of this program or these pathways until after that full cycle results come out. So there's going to be some time still. And then finally, these last 2 go together, metrics and assessing impact. It'd be really great to hear from CDA and also from the PCPA to understand their own internal evaluation processes of these metrics, and would, if they are a little bit more transparent about what they're aiming to achieve, could we understand the impact of is that really meeting what they feel it was intended as it was set out, and assessing impact. How many patients have actually benefited. I love, how many patients in the province actually drugs, even if listing was quick, what's the impact? And it's all this by year. NOCCs have gone through and 2023. So 2023 they got C and through TLR. 2024 there were 2 NOCCs granted, either with TLR way, and then we are expected to receive, or expected to receive NOCC. So let's see what happens. Are we really just going to be sitting at a drug a year? And is that opportunity being maximized for patients? Okay, let's keep going. One last thing on this is that, and I don't want to get into comparing INES and CDA, but I just want to point out that INES did also do their own, this is the HT body in Quebec, they did also do their own analysis and recommendation of Enhertu. This is the second TLR drug from CDA. So they have their own process in gastric cancer. And the result of that was actually negative based on therapeutic value. So there's probably a whole nother webinar to have around the NS process versus the CDA's process. One point I want to call out here is just that around patient equity and national alignment considerations. So we have these new pathways that have been established, but also there's this question of patient equity and alignment across all the provinces, etc. I just feel that seeing a negative recommendation come out of Quebec, it just means that it's not good or bad. I'm not making a value judgment here. I just want to say that we still need to consider, can these pathways promote equity and national alignment? Maybe there's some work to do on that front. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. The CDA, they've been, or, no, I'll say a few words. Peter's going to give us some details. I just want to say there's a lot of work that's been going on and at the CDA on accelerated access pathways. I think focusing for me on TLR, timeline recommendations, is where, we have the biggest opportunities to make the largest impact for patients who are waiting for access to drugs with, they have an unmet need, and these are innovative drugs where there's no other solution. I think Peter will tell us a little bit about PACEs and other things. For me, these are where, PACEs and the FMEC, it's comparing with comparable drugs that already exist in the market. So, my focus is really on where that opportunity is for novel drugs for an unmet need with patients. Okay, and I know that in the consultation, what we heard from those folks, there's Peter on the right already, up top right. is that they heard that TLR should be expanded beyond the current scope to other types of drugs with NOCC and drugs for rare diseases. And also, we saw a poster from the CDA in May that said that they're going to be still waiting for more files before making any other changes. So I'll let Peter talk to that. But really, it sounds like for the moment, CDA is not considering making changes or expanding the TLR pathway. I should also mention that about 94% of drugs that get NOCC are oncology drugs. So, it's interesting to see if we could expand that pathway to be more equitable to other drugs and patient populations that are waiting for drugs with a high unmet need. All right, let's keep going. Quickly, there is a new pilot project from the Ontario government to fast-track access to some cancer drugs. What is this? The Toronto Star reported in May that the Ontario government is aiming to fast-track cancer drugs in a new pilot project. So we have some quotes from Doug Ford, who's the Premier of Ontario, and also Sylvia Jones, the Ontario Health Minister. I want to just share with you essentially what this is. In a nutshell, it would mean that Ontario would list drugs as soon as a positive CDA recommendation is issued, and then they would conduct the PCP price negotiation to get to a final price in the future. So they're trying to, in that timeline, they're trying to then move up the listing earlier, so right after the HTA recommendation. So what they said in the announcement, they're launching a 3-year pilot to fast-track access to select high-priority cancer drugs, cutting wait times by at least 9 months. The program will, in essence, combine the approval and negotiation stages. It's a little bit confusing how that's worded, but it's about right after HTA recommendation. Ontario is moving ahead independently due to some jurisdictional issues, despite federal and some provincial support for faster access. So at the end of 2024, we did hear an announcement more from all of the provinces saying that they were going to look at this. And now Ontario has moved ahead and they're going to do their own thing for now. They're targeting drugs in Project Orbis, which is an international regulatory fast-track initiative. So interesting, take a read of the article, but it will be very interesting to see what's going on here. But I want to come back to this key thing is that we saw, they're saying here the 9 months, they think they can reduce that wait time by at least 9 months. And what they're talking about is the typical timeline that the PCPA would take to do their work on the pricing negotiation. So again, moving from that sequential, which we saw earlier, to more parallel processes. Just 2 days after this announcement, or 3 days, we saw an interesting announcement from the PCPA that actually they, on their side, have dropped their negotiation timelines from 9 months to 5 months for oncology drugs. So that's interesting. And they mentioned that they are going to be putting out a dashboard early July that has some details around that. So maybe, if the negotiation timelines are actually quicker than 9 months, maybe this Ontario program would only cut by 5 months. I'm not sure. We'll have to see how this all plays out. Now, why Project Orbis? This is, what is it? And even they're citing this in the article. It's an international regulatory collaborative model, which is run by the FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence. And it was launched in 2019. There's many international partners, 9 that participate, including Canada. And the idea of this program is that there's collaboration among international regulators to speed up access to cancer treatments in countries with extensive regulatory bottlenecks. So what's the benefit of it? For Health Canada, Orbis offers a way to collaborate with peer regulators and to access a broader evidence base. And for manufacturers, it's a mechanism for harmonizing regulatory submissions and perhaps get Canada included earlier in the launch plans to market a drug in this country. But I want to mention that currently there's no accelerated access process for drugs that Health Canada reviews through Project Orbis. So that's interesting, right? So we have a regulatory process. It's been going on since 2019. It means that potentially Canada could be higher up in terms of getting the regulatory process or submission of a drug. Health Canada would be working on that file, getting data from the FDA as shared through Project Orbis, but it doesn't, we don't have anything in Canada that says, oh, pick up Project Orbis drugs earlier and help acceleration with that. So it's kind of been an unbalanced acceleration program that hasn't seen a lot of acceleration on the access side here in our country. We've seen about 12 drugs per year. I know they said 10 in the press release, but here's some data on that. And really interesting is that Project Orbis submissions are expected to meet one of Health Canada's expedited review pathways, either priority review or advanced consideration for an NOCC. I know I'm getting tight on time. I really want to take you guys through this. I'm trying to go quick, and I hope I won't lose you. But so the thing is here is to connect is that Health Canada already has two longstanding regulatory mechanisms that support accelerated drug reviews. So I mentioned that NOCC and priority review. And in 2024, almost 20% of all Health Canada approvals, 22 of 115 files, were concluded under either NOCC or priority review. So we have a lot of details here about what these programs are. I just want you to retain that these are long-standing programs. We have almost 20% of drugs already going through them in a priority, meaning that they're being reviewed in either 180 or 200 days instead of 300. So that's Health Canada's regular timelines. And these programs are working well. This is a Canadian regulatory program that exists, and there's a lot of drugs that are going through them already. And also, all of those Orbis drugs should, in theory, be either part of NOCC or priority review. So there's some interesting potential alignment there. I just kind of want to plant the seed about these programs that already exist. So let's talk about this new pilot project from the Ontario government and what considerations are there for discussion. So the first thing is I want to bring in TLR to this again. We saw that TLR enabled files to be prioritized at the PCPA, and the most significant accelerator of that process so far. Really, the key takeaway from that was that prioritization of drug files in the process is a key drug access accelerator. And the second thing here is that the Ontario pilot project with cancer drugs under Project Orbis, it's a new prioritization category. So we already have NOCC drugs with major eligibility limitations being prioritized potentially under TLR. That's one pathway. And now we have the second Ontario pathway prioritizing cancer drugs that come through Project Orbis regulatory approval. So I'm going to put this out there for everyone for discussion. Why select only Orbis files? It's an awesome start, and I'm just wondering if could the current Health Canada acceleration files of priority review and other NOCC also be included in this Ontario pathway? I think it's really interesting. We have a homegrown process in the regulatory side that works really well. Maybe that's an opportunity for discussion. And finally, could there be a new urgency for outcomes-based agreements, implementation, and mechanisms here in Canada if Ontario moves to a list now and then negotiate a final listing price later approach? So last year we talked about all the different work going on in that space around how to implement these innovative agreements. Will we see more of a need for that as this Ontario program develops? Okay, let's skip that. I'm going to finish off with 2 more minutes. Future state considerations. Can we catch up with our international peers when we're looking at providing timely access for patients to novel therapies with a high unmet need? And what's next for Canada? Just one slide about the international side. We saw this together last year. When those formalized managed access pathways that connect all the pieces together are put in place, they can really work. And this is an example from the UK where they did provide access, so listing of this cancer drug in lung cancer at the same date as regulatory approval. This is already back in 2021. This is years ago. But they were able to essentially get these therapies to about 100 patients on the first day of regulatory approval, and then within a few months to over 600 patients. And as of this year, now in June 2024, this drug does continue to be funded under its managed access program as part of the Cancer Drugs Fund. So other countries have figured this out, how to put all the pieces together. I feel really hopeful that we can get here, but the bar is a very high access at regulatory approval. Okay, so some final thoughts. The path to timely and equitable access for Canadian patients is still very long. We keep seeing in the news examples where patients are waiting for a drug, patients can't get access to a drug that already exists and is approved for some patients on the market, and we see lots of new drugs coming with a high unmet need. And this is really, so hopeful and so interesting. And this pipeline is not slowing down, and the patient need is there. So we have a huge job to do. We continue to see inequities across our country. I want to keep that in mind, the inequity piece. The GI Society published a report earlier this year, and they showed that actually BC Pharmacare is rejecting more than 30 life-saving and life-altering medications that every other province covers. So the public drug plans are funding in other provinces, but not in BC. We continue to see these type of inequities in postal code lottery across Canada. So it is quite challenging. We have a lot of work to do on equity. However, there is a glass half full. Progress is being made, albeit very slowly. We've seen these first two drugs go through the TLR and PTAP pathway, the first part of that pathway, and the time was significantly decreased for time to access. It was so fantastic. I also want to say I really enjoyed this interview from the recently appointed new CEO of the PCPA, and where he speaks about working with partners to develop or evaluate negotiation pathways with the goal of speeding up timelines while still getting the right price for new drugs. This is very hopeful for me because I don't think in the past we've seen the PCPA say that their job, the mandate was beyond negotiation. And hearing senior leaders at the agencies across Canada say things like this about speeding up timelines while still getting the right price for new drugs, I just think it's very, very hopeful, and would love to see more, from the PCPA, of course, and all the others, but this type of leadership. So finally, Canadian-grown, timely, and equitable access solutions for patients are absolutely within reach. We've seen these new programs, we've learned from the international, but I would just encourage everyone to keep going, keep working on this. And I think that we can move from seeing two examples of drugs and how they've been really worked through a process when we've all come together to maybe perhaps a larger set where we get more equity for patients not only in oncology, but also rare disease and other patients with high unmet needs. So I'm going to stop there. I'm 3 minutes over. I'm sorry, guys. And I'd love to hear from, I think it's passing it over to Peter now, and then we'll have a chat with everyone about all this information. Thanks.
Allison, I'll just quickly say as Peter's slides get pulled up, as always, you did an amazing job. You covered an enormous waterfront in a compressed amount of time. There's a lot there to digest. Part of that will happen over the next 45 minutes, but part of it will happen and be incumbent on all of us over the coming weeks and months to think about how we keep this conversation going, how we add other voices like PCPA that you alluded to, and how we continue to learn together, collaborate together, and actually drive impact together. Because I think there is an increasing and intensifying awareness of our kind of common objectives and our shared responsibilities. And I think one of the key players in all of this is CDA AMC. And Peter's going to talk a little bit about their sort of pivotal role up to now and some ideas and perspectives on the future. So Peter, to you.
Thanks, Ross. And thank you to the Resilient Healthcare Coalition for the invitation today to join you all for this really important discussion. And thank you, of course, to Allison for the work that you do and your analysis today. I think it's a really helpful overview of the landscape, and I think a really nice way to kick off the discussion. I just wanted to take a few minutes really to do a bit of a shameless plug for Canada's Drug Agency and all the work we've done over the last few years, sort of from our perspective. So I don't have many slides. I just wanted to sort of kick off some of the work we've done in our own words before we sort of go into the discussion. So Haley, if you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So just a reminder for folks, if you follow our work and subscribe to our updates, you'll see that we just published our updated strategic plan, this one for the next 5 years. And so, I think when you look at our strategic pillars and the 5 principles, these really guide everything that we do. And, really our purpose is about evidence-driven decisions, and so it's all about maintaining integrity and excellence, partnership, agility, and inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility through everything we do. And so as we talk about accelerated access, we look at those things, through the lens of our guiding principles. If we go to the next slide, thank you. So when it comes to the Pharmaceutical Reviews Program, Over the last several years, under our sort of executive team's leadership, and beyond the strategic objectives, we've really looked at how can the pharmaceutical reviews team sort of adapt and modernize and really deliver sort of a more fit for purpose reimbursement review process. So, we've really looked to committing to dialogue and engagement and transparency through the process. That's been something that we've sort of put forward as a priority, but also improving the usefulness of our outputs. So looking at the recommendations that we post, making sure that there's clarity around what we're saying, and so that it's interpreted by all the various users of our work. Looking at streamlining our approach to how we do reviews, so that streamlining could actually help us allocate resources a bit more efficiently, and can help us match the increasing volume of reviews. Last year, we had a record of 98 new submissions started, and we are forecasting that this number will maintain for the next few years and then go up. But also we're seeing an increase in complexity of our reviews. So the diseases are getting a bit more complicated. The evidence that we're receiving is getting more complicated. And so each review is requiring a bit more work of us, and there's more of them. So we have to work a bit smarter, as we know that resources are finite ultimately. And then, finally, I think what's maybe most relevant to our discussion today is we do see within the Pharmaceutical Reviews Program is that our role is to play a bit of a catalyst across the continuum of the reimbursement pathway. And so we are relatively upstream. You might argue we're middle of the stream in terms of the reimbursement continuum, but we certainly can play a role in convening different groups across the continuum, which includes regulatory bodies and payers and PCPA, and sort of provide that catalyst for having discussions about how do we provide solutions to the system around accelerated access. And we've started to do that, and we have some examples of some exciting things we've just launched this fiscal year. So if we go to the next slide, just a bit of a timeline in terms of some of the things we've done over the last several years. So certainly we began with time-limited recommendations, or TLR, which Allison explained in great length. And so we've provided this platform for the last while, and our intent is to have 3 to 5 of these reviews go through before we sort of do a formal assessment of our learnings and where we can go next from here. And so as Allison mentioned, despite we've had 4 that were potentially eligible, according to Allison's count, there have perhaps been some others. We've had some examples of a sponsor actually opt out. So, we haven't been able to hit that 3 to 5 number yet, but I think part of it is that, it is a bit of a two-way dialogue. And so we can provide the opportunity for these sort of pathways, but ultimately we do need the sponsors to participate as well in order for us to sort of assess and ultimately look at the possibility of expansion. We then launched Target Zero last year, which, really the goal is trying to align as much as we can our draft recommendations with the timing of NOC. So trying to get that to 0 days if possible. And so, again, this really requires the participation of sponsors where we're looking at those sort of prior or those aligned reviews with Health Canada. And so the proportion of aligned reviews has improved since Target Zero, and so that's a really positive sign. But there are still opportunities for acceleration through there, just given that sponsors are eligible to submit up to 6 months pre-NOC, but on average, we're seeing sponsors come about 3 months pre-NOC. So there is still an opportunity on average to get those reviews in a little bit earlier in the process so that we can achieve a higher proportion of target zero. And then in 2025, so this past, I guess, January, we held consultations on an initiative we've launched for this fiscal, which is a PR renewal, pharmaceutical reviews renewal. And this was really looking at updating some of the programs we had around accelerated access, like TLR. So we did expand the scope slightly. We did start a rolling reviews pilot to try to help sponsors come in a bit sooner pre-NOC. And then most importantly, we've launched the PACES reviews process, which is for pharmaceuticals with anticipated comparable efficacy and safety, is what it stands for. But the idea is that with PACES, we would review those drugs in 100 to 120 days instead of the 180-day mark, so that we would shorten the timelines by at least 60 days. And then working very closely as a catalyst with PCPA to then work with them to also have them prioritize the negotiation for these files. And so really providing an opportunity, again, to accelerate files that are simpler and low risk so that we can reallocate our resources for some of the more challenging files that we're starting to see. So just I'll end it there. The last slide is just the shameless plug about please, if you have any questions, we always welcome the opportunity to talk about our work and some of the sort of modernization we're working on. And I'm looking forward to the discussion today. And if you'd like to subscribe to all of our different platforms and emails, there you have the QR code. Thanks, Ross.
Peter, thank you so much for highlighting and underscoring many of the points that Allison raised by offering a particular sort of from within the CDA perspective on some of the stuff. I'm really glad you flagged PACES at the end as well. So lots of things that your comments and Allison's comments have arisen in people's minds. Questions are coming in, which is amazing to see. So just a reminder to folks, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to share your thoughts and your questions. I've got a bunch that are already rolling in and we will get to them momentarily. But before we do, I want to bring a couple of more voices into this really important conversation. So Sabrina, I'm going to start with you. You've heard a lot from Allison and Peter and experienced yourself at the front lines of advocacy and policymaking from a patient perspective, all of the changes that we've seen in the last 12 months. So I'd love to give you a chance to reflect on this journey that we've taken kind of collectively, what you're excited about, where you still think we need to go, and I'll let you riff a bit on what you're most energized by in terms of the future and the challenges we're going to face on the way. So to you first, and then John will come to you next.
Thank you, Ross. I have a lot to say, so I'm going to try to go through it rather quickly. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. Allison, thank you for your updates. You are a boss. And Peter, for your shameless plug. Thank you. As an advocate, I want to say that I really appreciate the work that's gone into building momentum around accelerated access in Canada. However, I want to start the conversation, or I want to reframe the conversation from what are the risks of moving too fast to also include what are the risks of waiting too long. And so I applaud the intent, but how much impact are we making for patients with life-threatening disease? As it stands, the process is too restrictive to benefit a large population. So if the purpose of accelerated pathways is to enable earlier patient access to life-saving or life-altering therapies, then are we actually achieving this goal? We've had the 2 drugs enter the pathway in 2 years, and while the results for IPINCLY and INER2 show what's possible when stakeholders align, most patients aren't actually experiencing any of the acceleration. So we need to ask how well these pathways function, how appropriately they're applied, how well regulators, HTA bodies, payers, providers, and patients are working together. And obviously, these questions are not just in a Canadian context, they're questions that need to be asked globally. And so what are we doing this for? Are we trying to accelerate access for patients? If this were built for the patient, the design would be different. We'd start by asking what matters to them, We'd measure impact not just by how fast the listing occurs, but by who gets access, how equitably, as Allison mentioned also in her presentation, and what happens in the months and years after access begins. So the biggest gap I'm seeing is the absence of patient voice and lived experience in designing these processes. We aren't yet embedding patient data, patient-defined value, or real-world outcomes in our assessments or processes. We aren't collecting feedback post-listing to inform better future decisions, and we aren't accounting for the cost of delay, not just in dollars, but in lives lost, quality of life diminished, or the downstream costs of healthcare resource allocation from lack of best care available now. And so we can't talk about access in isolation from diagnostics. So HTA was never built to assess diagnostics. So even when we accelerate access to a drug, if the test that enables access isn't reviewed or reimbursed, patients won't get access, even if the drug went through an accelerated process, which, right now we're not looking at phase 2 data, so it's not an issue, but we have to think long term. We're also applying outdated evidence expectations to cutting edge science. So the time-limited recommendation requires confirmatory phase 3 trials, but many new treatments, particularly in oncology and rare disease, will never generate phase 3 data. So it's too niche, it's too targeted. If we cling to conventional endpoints, we'll stall an innovation rather than accelerate it. And I think just one last point, we can't ignore what is happening in the US, and there are credible concerns that the FDA may pull back from Project Orbis. So if this is true, that could disrupt one of the only global frameworks designed to coordinate cancer drug approvals, and that presents both a risk and an opportunity. And Canada has the chance to step up to be a globally trusted, science-driven, patient-centered environment for health innovation, but only if we act now. So the status quo where it takes 600 plus days from approval to listing won't make Canada a hub for innovation. It's going to leave us behind. So what we're seeing, the early signs of what's possible with TLR and PTAPs is encouraging, but we need to build the environment that it attracts the innovation, the investment, and the access. So I think what I would like to see happen in the next 12 months is we need to strengthen processes for stakeholder collaboration, and coordinated efforts will be required to implement meaningful change moving forward. We need to scale up the pathway because 2 drugs is not enough. We need to broaden eligibility. If only 4 out of 30 NOCC drugs even qualify, we're excluding patients by design. We need to build in the patient, not around, and patients and patient advocates should be involved earlier in accelerated access processes and should be integral to decisions about clinical development, outcome measurement, and timing of confirmatory trials. I've got a couple of more, but I'll stop there so I could give John a chance to also comment. I think if we could get these right, we can evolve from fragmented pilot projects to something more compassionate and responsive that works in the real world. And just to go to Allison's comment about PCPA, I actually just had a call with Maro Chais from the PCPA, and I'm also very encouraged with his leadership and what he's doing there. And they do have a new role that was listed, patient relations role. So I think that's also very encouraging.
Sabrina, thanks for reminding us that if we pull the lens back rather than really close, it's easier to see how much work is still to be done. And I think you put the patient back in the center of this conversation, which is absolutely essential. And I think you gave us a lot of things to think about over the next few minutes and beyond. So I really appreciate all of that. And we will come back to you because I want more from you too. John, why don't you jump in and give us your perspective from the Amgen seat, from the industry seat on where we've come from, where we are, and frankly, where we still need to go.
Okay, well, thanks, Ross, and thanks to my co-panelists, some great insights, some great data, and really a great conversation. As you can probably tell from my gray hair, I've been in the industry for a few days, and I would have to say this is the first time in my 30 plus years in the industry that I have a high degree of optimism of the momentum that we're seeing and something that we can effectively build on. And the first, I think, good piece of news here is that every major stakeholder, or the vast majority of stakeholders, whether that be CDA and now PCPA, patient groups, politicians, and industry, recognized that this is actually a problem. Time to patient access. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I don't think we had that consensus. Today, I think we do, or it's continuing to build in the right direction. And when you have consensus on a problem, it allows for conversations like today to happen, where we can find solutions to those problems and move forward in a positive, constructive way. So that to me is a big step forward just unto itself. But why does that matter? Why is that problem recognition even important? And I think the numbers speak to themselves. And many people on the line, and I certainly know my panelists know these data, is that Canada is last in the G7 countries and 19th out of 20 OECD countries in terms of timely access to publicly covered drugs. Allison talked about the average delay being 600 plus days from the time of Health Canada approval to provincial listing. And the consequences to that are exactly what Sabrina just talked about. Patients wait, die prematurely, unnecessarily, or live with a significantly impaired quality of life unnecessarily. In addition to that, those patients are using up significant healthcare resources, which does not support a system that already has massive sustainability issues. And the last, I think, really important component around the consequence is that many global companies look at Canada and are starting to deprioritize it. It's far too complex. It takes too long. The price value is significantly lower than other countries. So why would they choose to invest in Canada? And I think Sabrina brought up a really good point. In today's tense geopolitical climate, not only are some of the expected processes maybe to die, but a slower access, I think, process puts Canada even at a bigger strategic disadvantage, and something that we definitely need to address from an economic perspective. But for sure, there are early glimpses of successes, and I want to applaud the TLR, PTAP groups for the work that they've done, whether that be PCPA, CDA, and the industry body that worked collaboratively to find that. And when you couple that with the CDA's Target Zero, shout out to Peter, great work there, and you begin the negotiation process with PCPA at the time of draft recommendation, you can deliver demonstrable impact. And Allison talked about the InHER2 case study, which is a great example. And within S, some of the promise of value programs that they're running are also showing signals of success in the CAR-T space. But the problem is, and I think Sabrina alluded to this, the scope is too narrow. Unfortunately, the strict criteria of the TLR PTAP process means that only 2 drugs since 2023 have actually gone through that process. Drugs of rare disease, drugs with small population-based cancers that can never generate phase 3 data will not qualify for this process. Medicines that have strong phase 3 life-saving evidence already generated have to go through the sequential process. And Allison showed you the difference between that versus the TLR PTAP process. So what I think, or what I truly believe we need, is an end-to-end rethink of this current sequential reimbursement process, to re-engineer it, to make it faster, more scalable, and far more inclusive to all innovations that have life-saving benefit. Several EU countries, Allison referred to UK, but we see Germany and France also have come up with innovative processes that allow that faster access to occur. And certainly there are lessons that we can learn from them. And there are lessons that we can learn from our own experiments with PTAP and the TLR process and Project Zero. So specifically for Canada, where I think we need to move to is really a list now, reconcile the price later process. What does that mean? I think it means that we can immediately list high unmet need drugs that can be defined through Project Orbis or through the Health Canada priority review process. By definition, these are drugs of high unmet need, and that they can be listed provincially after a positive CDA recommendation or at the draft recommendation stage. You can then negotiate the price through the PCPA process and reconcile that rebate back to the listing date. So that Canadians continue to accrue the value definition of the new innovation, but get access to that therapy, hopefully, right at NOC. And if you link that process to the Target Zero program that Peter described, done right, patients could theoretically have access upon NOC to these new life-saving innovations. And that would result, I think, in a step change reduction in the time to patient access for critical medicines, moving from years down to months or even days in some cases. So we all know that any change does come with risk. And what I've talked about here, yes, there is risk. What happens if PCPA, there's an impasse and we don't negotiate an effective price? And realistically, that will probably happen some of the time. If you look at the German model, it happens about 8 to 10% of the time. But I would argue that Canadians would accept the 90% success rate versus focusing in on the 10% problem rate to get the access to the medications that Sabrina, I think, just really clearly made the case on the importance to them. And that 10%, I think through smart contractual clauses, provisional pricing approaches, and or off-ramping systems, you can shrink that risk even further. And lastly, I just want to shout out to Ontario. I applaud Ontario's announcement and their bold initiative to take on a new cancer drug fast-tracking project. I think their process of merging approval and price steps to cut access by that 9 months is courageous. It's not dissimilar to the Germany model and not too dissimilar to what I've described, but I think that is a real world model we could scale across Canada and make some transformational difference. Over the next 12 months, Ross, just to pick up on the last part of your question, I really urge other provinces to look at joining Ontario and that bold initiative. And I think collectively, let's give patients that faster hope, strengthen our healthcare system, making it more resilient, if I can use the Resilient Healthcare Coalition as an example, and keep Canada competitive, but also a compassionate nation. We have the knowledge. Allison has showed us the data. We've got pilot projects underway that we can learn from both locally and globally. And I think Canadians deserve timely access to medicines that actually save or extend their lives. And I think it's time that we make that a national reality over the next 12 to 24 months. So those are my thoughts, Ross.
John, thanks for that. And you said a lot of things that I'm going to come back to in some of the questions we throw to this group next. But Sabrina, maybe I'll just come to you first and give you a chance, if you'd like it, I know you had a couple of other things you wanted to share. So if you'd like to do it now, I'm happy to share the microphone. There will also be other opportunities as we go, but I wanted to start by giving you that chance, if that's helpful.
Yeah, so I just want to point out some of the challenges and opportunities for accelerated pathways that I see from a purely patient perspective. So one of the biggest challenges with accelerated access is that it doesn't actually feel accelerated. So we're still far behind in bringing drugs to market in comparison to the US and the EU. And Allison and John, you both talked about the programs that other countries are doing, but we still have that delay in when the drug is actually coming to Canada. And so that is not a regulatory reimbursement problem, that is an industry problem, but still something that I think we could do a better job at. And so again, we've only seen the 2 drugs go through the process in 2 years. CDA doesn't want to expand the eligibility until they get a few more drugs through that process, but there's no timeline on when that could actually happen. So it could be a year, but it could also be 5 years. There's also, again, the misalignment between regulatory expectations and the reality of modern drug development. So if we want accelerated access to be meaningful, we need regulatory and HTA frameworks that evolve with the science. There are inconsistent evidence requirements that are also contributing to delays in patient access. So we need more alignment globally on evidentiary requirements that would make it easier to bring life-saving therapies to patients. I know this is a hard ask, given that we can barely coordinate within our own country. And speaking of what is happening in our own country, I mean, in INR2 is the perfect example. CDA approves, ENES doesn't approve. So, I mean, this is a huge inequity, and how can we overcome this? Patients also can provide a lot of data that can help reduce uncertainty in decision making, but that data is still seen as qualitative rather than quantitative. So I think that there is a challenge, but also an opportunity in using that data. In our definition of value also, so most HTA processes value is reduced to cost of effectiveness ratios and qualities. But from a patient perspective, value is about what the treatment gives back. So whether that's time, independence, being able to return to work or take care of kids, reduce caregiver burden, that's not really factored into the value of a drug. And speaking of value, Eva, you will appreciate this. We need to build in value-based outcomes. So we're not just asking, is this affordable, but we're asking, is this working for patients in the real world? And if it is, we fund it. If it's not, we adapt. And that's how we build a system that's both accountable and responsive to the real needs of patients. So, I mean, I think the system has to ask better questions. So not can we afford this, but can patients afford to wait? That we see patient experience as evidence, not just anecdote, and that value outcomes like staying employed, parenting, maintaining independence are also included. And also a system where accelerated access actually feels accelerated, because for patients, the clock doesn't start at regulatory approval, it starts with diagnosis. So every delay after that matters.
So Sabrina, thanks for all that. And there are so many questions that have come in, and so many things. I wish we had like at least twice as long for this session as we do. It shows the hunger that this group has to talk about something so important and so timely. So I'm going to pick up on. I'll try to jam as many of these in as I can. So maybe factor that in as you guys answer in your own thoughtful ways, and see if we can get 4 or 5 done in the next kind of 15 minutes or so. John, you used the word risk, and I want to sort of pull that word out for a second. And it feels like, Peter, lots of folks are going, but you've only had 2. Like, what's going on? And I wonder if there's if you could comment a little bit on what you've heard from folks about challenges perhaps with using the process as it is. What would it take to get that number up to the 3 or 4 or 5 that you talked about in terms of getting that feedback? And maybe from there we can have a quick chat about how we ensure that risk sharing across all of the players involved in this conversation happens in a way that is balanced and appropriate, so that nobody feels like they're being disadvantaged and everybody feels there's value in figuring out how to do this together. So do you want to talk a little bit about your sort of current state and what you're thinking about doing to make sure you get the insights and the inputs you need so you can get the reforms for the next version? You could think beyond NOCC. Where are you at on that? And how does this group, how can we help you get that data you need to continue to progress your own processes?
Can you hear me, Ross? I feel
We
like
can.
I feel like my screen, it looks like I'm frozen on my screen. So
your voice is great.
Okay.
You're very handsome in your immobility.
Okay, that's good. I look very pensive. That's not a bad, could be worse.
It could
be a worse way to get frozen. So it's a very loaded question. I mean, I can't really speculate on the risk that manufacturers are seeing with the process. I mean, I think I would defer to sort of John to provide his perspective from his seat. I could tell you that the overarching sort of purpose of TLR, which Sabrina had raised a question on, is it's not necessarily wasn't designed with the intent of speeding up an individual an individual listing of an individual file. It was actually intended on, and I can even read the wording we have. It's about temporary recommendations issued when there's uncertainty in the evidence, but that the drug shows promise for addressing a need. And so, it's interesting, the comparisons that we've seen today, around the timelines, 300 days versus 600 days, or 100 days versus 600 days, those are, in my mind, actually not the right comparison, because the sort of alternate scenario potentially be for these files that they would not be listed at all, that there would potentially be a do not reimburse recommendation. And so, and that's not a stretch to see, considering what we have seen from our sort of sister organization with UNAS on one of the files, that if your comparison is not having access at all, then TLR doesn't just speed up access by 200. It could be by several years, because we're waiting for that phase 3 data to come, potentially, if we don't have TLR. And so there is a risk share inherent in TLR, that when the committee is deliberating upon the evidence, there is a significant amount of uncertainty with phase 2 data and an NOCC. And so they're being asked to look at those files a little bit differently than they would a standard file. And I think that's where, the risk that, Canada's Drug Agency sees, that's where we're sharing in the risk. And so, I think if we are to look at expanding this, it would be along those lines. It's uncertainty in the evidence, and how do we share the risk from sort of a deliberation perspective. And so, I think from some of the examples we heard, like John mentioned, there's other opportunities in other therapeutic areas where there is uncertainty in evidence, like drugs for rare diseases. And certainly those are opportunities that we're thinking about. The challenge, of course, will become, with the uncertainty in the data, if we are to provide a temporary reimbursement recommendation, it's how do we validate that the drug has achieved the outcomes that it's set out to achieve. And so right now, the TLR process is set up so that we require phase 3 data. And the nice thing about phase 3 data is that it's global, it's predetermined, and we know it's coming. And so there's very little risk in that data will come, and it will come in a certain timeline. If we go beyond clinical trial data, which we are, of course, need to think about, that's when you start to introduce a lot of risk around, if we're going to look at RWE, especially local RWE, there's a lot of questions about, will that data come? Will it come on the timeline that's been promised? And so it does open up the risk significantly from what we currently have. And so, I think those are the questions we're sort of thinking through. But again, before we even think about making some of these leaps, it's about, can we accept the risk of the process as it stands today? And I think the challenge is, only having 2 gone through this, we have yet to have the opportunity to sort of see that through. And it would be great if we had more, but that's, the other side of the coin is, why can't we even get these to get through, right? Because there have been more than 2 that have been eligible. And so there is an element of, we'd like to expand this, but there has to be a partnership that sponsors need to come to the table as well, for us to be able to do this. I'll stop
Peter,
there.
thank you for all that, and appreciate your thoughtfulness and candor. So I don't know if anybody else wants to pick up on the risk sharing piece or this question, or whether we keep going to some of the other ones we've got. So I'll just pause to see if anybody wants to jump in, or I'll keep going.
I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Sabrina.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Thanks, guys.
Just a very short statement. So when we think about risk, especially in these pathways, it's always one-sided. So it's the regulatory uncertainty or financial exposure for payers and decision makers, but we're not thinking about it from a patient perspective. So right now, the patients are taking the totality of the risk.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Sabrina.
I think,
John.
so I first of all, I echo Sabrina's point. At the end of the day, this is really about patients, serving patients, making a healthier population, and serving and being a compassionate nation to patients that need it, right? And it also indirectly supports system sustainability and economic benefit. Nothing is perfect. There's always going to be risk. In the example that I gave, in the example that Peter gave, and even in the examples that Sabrina, gave, there's risks here, and we have to learn how to share that risk.
Yeah.
And Peter's exactly right. That has to be a shared reality, a shared risk across the manufacturer, the HTA body, and the PCPA and the jurisdictions to make this right. But I do believe that if we can navigate those risks, because there are always solutions to them, that the outcome and the benefit for the patient is what's important, and it's incumbent on us to find that, how to mitigate those risks and how to live with those risks, so that patients can benefit from the outcome, and indirectly we realize the economic benefits of that with a healthier population.
Thanks, John. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out the best way to handle all of the very interesting concepts that people have raised in the Q&A. And I think what I'm going to do is actually do a quick summary of some of the really interesting points that folks have called to this group's attention. And then I'll get out of the way and perhaps give each of you just a minute or two to offer your sort of final thoughts on what you've heard, on what you've all shared. And maybe one of the lenses you can bring to your responses to think about what are the most immediate opportunities for us to collectively advance this conversation. Because I think we've heard about the importance of shifting from sequential to parallel, and that it is absolute magic. And Allison, you put the numbers up to show this, when you move from this to this, and that needs to become more of a default norm rather than an exception. We had folks commenting on the challenges around equity between different therapeutic areas and their likelihood on the NOCC side, and then what happens post-listing when you have provinces that list in different ways, or even different HTA recommendations in S versus CDA. We heard about the importance of tracking value after reimbursement to know that the actual kind of promise of a particular therapy is actually being unlocked and delivered. And that relates to system readiness and the ability to have systems that are ready to implement and actually ensure that that last mile of access is being closed. We talked about the importance of different endpoints beyond phase 3. So there's a lot of hunger and interest from all of the folks weighing in to say, listen, we've seen a little bit of what better looks like. We have this optimism that John talked about. We have this importance of ensuring we continue to loop everything back to the patient in the central way that Sabrina talked about. But there's so much more still to do. So, Allison, I'm going to come back to you because you live and breathe this stuff every day. I'll maybe give you a first chance to reflect a little bit on where you see the greatest promise and potential over the next, let's say now to the end of the year. You could go 12 months if you want. If we bring you back another 12 months from now for sort of the third annual installment of this series, what are you hoping we will be able to talk about in 2026? And what do we all need to do together to actually allow that to happen, the milestones and the indicators? So do you want to kick that away? And then we'll go around the circle. Perhaps we'll go to John, to Peter, and then Sabrina will give you the last word on this.
Sure. Thanks, Ross. And thanks everyone for your comments. I think for me, what I'd like to see in the next year is a little bit of simplification. I saw a question somebody from the audience asked about, oh, this seems really complex. And actually, it all is very complex, like these different pathways, these different processes, what's eligible, what's not. It's actually very difficult to sort of boil down into a few key points. So what I would love to see is this continued momentum from all the agencies. The work that CDA, AMC is doing, the work that NS is doing, the work that the PCPA is doing. And I see manufacturers in the industry really trying to step up to these opportunities. They're faced with their own challenges as well. And the complexity of some of these programs and pathways, and the way that it's actually quite difficult to explain value to their global organizations, I think it's just making it really tough. At the same time, we've seen Ontario step up with trying to look at an accelerated access pathway. So I don't know, blue sky idea. Why don't we make it simple? We already see a well-established Health Canada process to accelerate their regulatory reviews for priority review and NOCC drugs. And then we saw the PCPA being able to pick up files at draft recommendation from draft review from the CDA. So could we just cut everything out and say, is the PCPA able to pick up files earlier if there's been a prioritization identified all at regulatory? That's something I'm curious about. Maybe just plant a seed for everyone to think about. And then in a year from now, I'd love to be seeing a lot of these inequities across our provinces broken down. It's so encouraging to see Ontario go on their own and find a new opportunity or explore that for accelerated access. But I'm going to echo what John said. It'd be amazing to see the other provinces also step up. We have this unifying body at the PCPA that's doing negotiations, more equitable for patients. And finally, just one point I saw in the chat as well, a question around actual implementation of some of these very complex drugs. We have a first listing in some provinces for some of these drugs that went through accelerated pathways. Are patients actually getting access? Have the provinces been able to implement? I don't have the answers to that, and I think it's very, very complex. There's so many, maybe there's another conversation on health system readiness and implementation. I'm hoping we can see some of those three things: simplification, continued collaboration towards equity, and then health system implementation be discussed in a year from now. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Amazing. Thanks, Allison. Peter, I think we're going to you next.
Yeah, I think great comments, Allison. I mean, but if we made it simple, I wouldn't have a job, right? So I need to take care of my own work. No, you're absolutely right. I think, and I'll go back to one of the comments. I mean, Sabrina made that I jotted down, is that with a lot of these, most patients aren't benefiting, right? We are slicing and dicing sort of small-ish segments of patients, and so that is something that I think can tackle. Is we've been focused on these sort of pilots of these sort of subgroups or subpopulations. Is there something that we can do that's a bit more geared towards the entire population of every review and every drug that comes through? Because that, even if we move the needle a little bit on all of our reviews, that will impact more patients than moving the needle more for a subset of them. So that is something we're thinking about, and something for our sort of planning for next year is how can we help facilitate sort of these improvements for everyone, or for a greater proportion of patients. Because I agree, at the end of the day, we need to put the patient at the center of everything that we're doing. And so from that lens, I think we have some ideas of how to approach that. So how can we sort of move the needle more broadly? And so that's one plug. The other plug I'll say, and I've alluded to it a little bit already, is that we can lead a horse to water, but we cannot make it drink. And so I think we are thrilled with the collaboration that we've seen so far. We've got 3 PACES reviews so far that we've initiated. We've got the 2 TLR reviews, with another one potentially in the pipeline. But there is an opportunity for more sponsors to help and participate in these sort of avenues that we open. And the more participation we get from sponsors, the faster we can test and learn, and the faster we can progress. And so I think there are opportunities for sponsors to participate a bit more in our Target Zero pathway, to get that number as close to 100% as we can, and get those submissions in 6 months pre-NOC as close as we can. And particularly, I know we didn't talk, or at least I didn't speak to the Orbis discussion so much, but I will refer everyone. My last point is I'll refer you to the Sears group, not the chain of stores that closed, but CIRS. They released a report, their RD briefing number 96, where they actually looked at the timing of Orbis drugs, and of course there's 3 types of Orbis, A, B, and C, which we didn't get into. But one of the challenges we saw with Orbis was actually the time from regulatory review to submission to HTA in Orbis A and C. And it's significant. It's not the 46 days we saw with TLR, it was 200 plus days for Orbis A. And so those are opportunities where we can work together with sponsors to really help shorten the time so that we're all risk sharing, that as we are tightening our timelines, the sponsors are doing their part as well. And we know that they have their own challenges. So, but coming to the table and doing this together. Thanks, Ross.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. John, and last word to Sabrina.
Okay, I see we're running really thin on time here, so I'll be quick. So, I think the solutions that we've talked about are all good and great. At the end of the day, I think there are 3 things that we need to ensure that we're doing here. I think we all agree it needs to be faster, right? I think there's universal agreement on that, and there are different models of how to do that. But that whatever model we choose, it needs to be scalable. It needs to be able to ramp up to include many more drugs that are meeting many more unmet needs that are life-threatening for patients and/or are significantly impairing the quality of life. So it's got to be scalable. And the last component that it has to be inclusive. And inclusive, what I mean by inclusive is obviously the regulatory framework. We've got Orbis, we've got priority review that Allison referred to, and I think that those are key. But it also needs to be inclusive of the patient. And I think Sabrina has done a wonderful job in stating that today on why a patient's point of view and inclusion is so important. And we have to keep the patient as the center of attention, the centerpiece of our objective. And inclusive also means equity across the country, because the current inequities, the postal code lottery is not right. And so to me, those are the 3 things that we have to ultimately solve for, or ultimately need to include in the solution. It's got to be faster, it's got to be scalable, and it needs to be inclusive.
Very well distilled. Thanks, John. Sabrina.
So I agree with everything everybody said, but I also want to add that it's not just about how well the process functions or how fast, but also what it delivers. So I'll leave it there.
Well, so I will take this moment very briefly just to thank all of you on behalf of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition for another fantastically important, clearly a conversation that people are hungry to have. There's an enormous number of questions and thoughts and perspectives being shared in parallel. This is a conversation that matters to us as RHC. It's an honor to have all of you share this podium and this panel with us, and cannot thank you enough for your contributions. If you're interested in RHC, go to resilienthealthcare.ca. You'll find some very interesting reading, including a new joint mandate letter we issued to the Ministers of Industry and Health, shaping a new federal government and how it can better link wealth and health together. So thank you all. Stay tuned. More from RHC soon. Appreciate having you all. We'll be in touch.